At 2:17 a.m., the quiet street woke up to a sound that didn't belong there, heavy, angry banging, like someone trying to break a house open from the inside. Margaret Hayes was the kind of neighbor people described with a soft smile. Mid-50s, neatly kept hair, always a cardigan even when the air felt warm. She lived alone in a modest house with a back garden that sloped toward a narrow alleyway. The curtains were usually drawn by dusk, the porch light always on, and her routine rarely shifted: groceries on Tuesdays, a short walk on Thursdays, a phone call with her sister every Sunday evening. She wasn't rich, but she was careful. If she bought something nice, she kept it put away. A few pieces of jewelry, sentimental more than flashy. A little cash for emergencies. A wallet she kept in the same place every day, as if order itself could keep danger out. That night, the street looked the way it always did: dark hedges, a line of parked cars, and windows reflecting pale, distant streetlights. But there were people awake. Across the way, a neighbor sat up in bed, frowning at the noise. Another rose to the window and peered through blinds. Someone whispered, "Do you hear that?" like saying it out loud might make it stop. The banging came again, followed by a dull thud, then a pause so long it let everyone's imagination run wild. Then, movement. In the back garden, a shape passed through shadows, heading toward the alley. A man, moving quickly, shoulders tense, carrying what looked like bags. Not shopping bags, heavier than that, dragging them close to his body like he didn't want them seen. The neighbor's breath fogged the glass as they leaned closer, heart tapping against ribs. A car idled somewhere nearby, low and impatient. The man disappeared toward the rear gate. A moment later, the car's engine rose in pitch, then the vehicle rolled away into the night, taillights shrinking until the street was quiet again. Quiet, but wrong. Morning arrived with its usual dull light and the ordinary sounds of life: bins rolling, doors closing, a distant dog barking. Margaret's porch light was still on. Her curtains were still drawn. By midday, the small concerns began. A friend tried calling. No answer. Her sister called next, then sent a message. The silence stretched, getting heavier with every hour. In the afternoon, a neighbor finally walked up the path with a tight feeling in their chest, telling themselves they were overreacting. Maybe Margaret had fallen asleep. Maybe she'd gone out. Maybe her phone was on silent. At the back of the house, the door was unlocked. That, more than anything, made the neighbor's stomach sink. Margaret didn't leave doors unlocked. They stepped inside, calling her name once, then again, louder. The hallway smelled faintly stale, like a house that hadn't breathed in hours. Shoes sat neatly by the wall. A handbag lay where it didn't usually belong. And near the rear doorway, just beyond the threshold of the kitchen, the neighbor saw Margaret. She was on the floor, still and unresponsive, as if the life had been pulled out of the room and left nothing behind. The neighbor stumbled backward, hands shaking, mouth dry, vision narrowing to a single terrible point. Somewhere in the house, a drawer hung open. Then another. And another. The bedroom looked as if someone had searched it with frantic hands. Cushions overturned. A jewelry box displaced. The kind of mess that shouted one word: theft, even as the rest of the scene whispered something darker. There were no broken windows. No splintered frames. No sign anyone had forced their way in. Which meant Margaret had either opened the door herself, or the person who came in never needed to break anything at all. Police arrived within minutes, blue lights washing over the house and spilling across the garden fence. Officers moved carefully through the rooms, their voices low, their expressions already guarded. What they saw did not look accidental. It did not look sudden. It looked deliberate. Margaret Hayes had been attacked with overwhelming force. The marks on her body told a grim story: repeated injuries, close-range violence, and signs that the struggle had not ended quickly. A cord, thin but strong, had been used with intent. The kind of object someone brings or finds when they've already decided what they're going to do. Yet the house told a different story. Drawers were open. Clothes had been pulled free and tossed aside. The jewelry box lay empty on the bed, its velvet lining exposed like a wound. Her wallet was gone. A laptop missing. A few small but meaningful items, things Margaret would never willingly part with. To an untrained eye, it looked like a break-in that went too far. But investigators had seen enough scenes like this to recognize the signs. The mess wasn't random. It was selective. Certain areas were torn apart, others left untouched. The chaos felt staged, like a performance designed to sell a lie. There was still no sign of forced entry. The back door showed no damage. No splintering. No tool marks. Whatever had happened, Margaret had been inside when it began. And whoever entered had done so easily. Neighbors were interviewed one by one. Their accounts lined up in uneasy ways. The banging. The movement in the garden. The man with the bags. One neighbor described the way he walked, fast, controlled, purposeful. Not panicked. Not drunk. Another mentioned the car, dark-colored, engine running low, waiting like it had been there before. A timeline began to form. Sometime after midnight, a vehicle arrived. Hours later, it left. And Margaret never answered another call again. Forensic teams worked through the night. Fingerprints were lifted from surfaces that shouldn't have been touched. Fibers were collected. The cord was sealed in evidence, handled like a fragile truth. By morning, detectives were already uneasy with the burglary theory. Too much violence for simple theft. Too personal. Too close. Whoever had done this hadn't just wanted Margaret's belongings. They had wanted control. As the investigation widened, cameras became the silent witnesses no one could intimidate or confuse. Street footage showed a car pulling up near the house during the night. The angle was poor, the lighting worse, but the shape, the timing, the movement matched what neighbors described. Another camera, farther down the road, captured the same vehicle leaving in the early hours. And then, unexpectedly, something else. A service station on the edge of town. Bright lights. Clean floors. A place people went when they thought they were invisible among strangers. The car pulled in. A man stepped out, pacing near the entrance. In his hands was a wallet. He opened it, checked inside, closed it again. He spoke to someone off camera, then gestured toward his pocket. Moments later, he approached the counter, jewelry glinting under fluorescent lights as he tried to sell it casually, like it meant nothing. But it meant everything. The timestamp burned itself into the case file. The wallet. The jewelry. The calm, almost bored expression on his face. Someone had left Margaret's house with her life already behind them. And they hadn't gone far at all. Once the car was identified, the investigation accelerated. Analysts traced its registration, mapped its movements, and built a picture of the hours after Margaret's death. What stood out was not chaos, but order. The vehicle was cleaned the following day. Interior panels wiped. Mats removed and shaken out. Someone had taken time to erase a night they knew would be questioned. But erasing everything is harder than it sounds. Days later, items began turning up in places they didn't belong. A scarf caught in bushes near the alley. Personal belongings discarded along a roadside. Each find tightened the circle around one man, Daniel Brooks. Brooks was in his late 30s, known to police for petty offenses and drifting employment. He had no visible connection to Margaret Hayes. No shared friends. No business ties. Nothing that explained why he would be inside her home in the middle of the night. Which made him all the more dangerous. When officers searched the areas connected to his movements, they found what cleaning couldn't undo. fibers that matched the cord. Prints where there shouldn't have been any. And eventually, traces that placed his hands exactly where Margaret had fought for her life. The evidence spoke calmly, patiently, and without emotion. Brooks was arrested at a relative's house. He did not resist. He did not explain. He sat in the interview room, arms folded, eyes flat, refusing to answer a single question. Silence, he seemed to believe, was safer than truth. But the case was already growing beyond him. Cameras had shown a second figure in the story, a woman behind the wheel. Her name was Laura Mitchell. Phone records placed her with Brooks throughout the night. Messages on her device raised immediate alarms. Before Margaret's body had been found, before the news had broken, Laura had typed words that only someone involved could know. Details that had not been shared. Details that could not be guessed. When confronted, Laura's story came out in pieces. She said she had been afraid. Said Brooks controlled her. That he had demanded her help, ordered her to drive, told her not to ask questions. She claimed she didn't know what had happened inside the house, only that something had gone wrong. But investigators saw the gaps. She had waited. She had driven. She had stopped at the service station. She had watched him handle stolen property without protest. She had helped clean the car. She had stayed silent long after fear should have turned into a cry for help. The messages on her phone were especially damaging, not panicked, not confused, but knowing. Calm. Almost practical. As Brooks sat in custody, refusing to speak, the weight of the evidence closed in. The cord. The personal items. The trail of discarded belongings. The quiet precision of his movements after the fact. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a robbery that spiraled. It was a choice, followed by many more. And the people who made those choices were about to learn how little silence could protect them once the truth had found its voice. As the case moved toward court, the quiet street where Margaret Hayes had lived returned to its routine, but the calm felt artificial, like a stage reset after something terrible had been revealed. Neighbors still glanced toward the house when they passed, their memories filling in what the police tape no longer marked. Inside the investigation, however, nothing had settled. Experts reconstructed Margaret's final hours with clinical precision. They charted her movements, the timing of the attack, and the sequence of actions that followed. The conclusion was clear: the violence had been sustained, controlled, and intentional. This was not panic. It was dominance. The cord told its own story. Fibers recovered from Daniel Brooks' clothing matched it. Traces found beneath Margaret's fingernails connected directly back to him. There was no mistaking the physical link between the man who refused to speak and the woman who never had another chance to. Brooks' silence became part of the prosecution's strategy. Jurors would hear how he chose not to deny, not to explain, not to express shock or confusion. He simply sat there, motionless, as evidence stacked higher around him. Laura Mitchell, meanwhile, spoke often, and contradicted herself just as frequently. On some days, she said she believed Brooks was capable of anything. On others, she claimed she never imagined someone could cross that line. She described fear, control, and emotional pressure, but the messages on her phone remained unchanged, messages that showed awareness, timing, and knowledge no bystander could possess. Investigators walked the jury through those texts slowly. The times. The wording. The details that matched the scene before it was public. Each message chipped away at the image of a frightened passenger with no choice. The service station footage was played in court. The screen showed Brooks handling Margaret's wallet like an object with no history. Jewelry passed between hands under bright lights, an ordinary setting made unsettling by what the items represented. Laura's car was examined again. Even after cleaning, it still carried the faint traces of that night. Small things. Easily missed. Impossible to explain away. The defense argued fear. Coercion. Survival. The prosecution argued choice. They argued that Laura had time to leave, time to call for help, time to refuse. Instead, she waited. She drove. She stayed. And above all, she knew. As the trial progressed, the courtroom grew heavier. Margaret's sister sat through every session, hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes fixed forward. She listened as strangers dissected the life of someone she loved, reduced to timelines and exhibits. But when the prosecution spoke of Margaret as a person, not a victim, not evidence, the room shifted. She had trusted. She had lived carefully. And she had been alone when someone decided that didn't matter. By the time closing arguments approached, the story was no longer about uncertainty. It was about responsibility. And the jury was about to decide who would carry it for the rest of their lives. The jury deliberated behind closed doors while the courtroom sat suspended in a strange, breathless pause. Outside, reporters waited for movement. Inside, Margaret Hayes' family sat quietly, bracing for an answer that could never truly feel like justice. When the jurors returned, their faces were set. The foreperson stood, papers trembling slightly in their hands. Daniel Brooks was found guilty. The evidence left no space for doubt. The cord. The traces. The discarded items. The footage. The silence he had chosen instead of explanation. The court described his actions as deliberate, calculated, and final. When the sentence was read, life in prison, Brooks showed no visible reaction. No anger. No remorse. He simply stared ahead, as if the decision belonged to someone else. But the case did not end there. Laura Mitchell rose next. Her trial had forced the jury to wrestle with a harder question: fear or free will? Abuse or assistance? Victim or accomplice? The prosecution revisited her actions step by step. She drove to the house. She waited while the night stretched on. She left with Brooks. She stopped at the service station. She watched him handle items that were never his. She helped clean the car. She sent messages that revealed knowledge she should not have had. Fear may explain silence. It does not explain participation. The jury found her guilty of helping Brooks avoid responsibility and of assisting in the removal and disposal of evidence. When the sentence was delivered, Laura broke down, covering her face, her earlier certainty collapsing into sobs. She was led away, her future narrowed to concrete walls and locked doors. Margaret's sister closed her eyes as the verdicts were read. It wasn't relief. It wasn't peace. It was something quieter, a recognition that the truth had at least been spoken out loud. The judge addressed the court directly. Margaret Hayes had lived carefully. She had harmed no one. She had been entitled to safety in her own home. What happened to her was not chance, not misfortune, but the result of choices made by others. As the courtroom emptied, the house on the quiet street remained empty too. Its windows dark. Its garden untended. A space once filled with routine and small comforts now reduced to memory. Justice had been delivered in legal terms. But what lingered was the cost. And the knowledge that sometimes, danger doesn't announce itself loudly, it waits, patient and ordinary, until it's already too late. Years later, Margaret Hayes' name still surfaced quietly in the community, not in headlines, but in conversations that trailed off mid-sentence. People remembered her as she had been before the night defined her story, careful, polite, predictable in ways that once felt comforting. Her house was eventually sold. New curtains appeared in the windows. Fresh paint covered the walls. But some neighbors said the back garden never quite felt the same, as if the ground itself remembered the footsteps that had crossed it in darkness. Daniel Brooks began his life sentence behind walls designed to hold people who could not return to the world they had broken. He never explained why he chose Margaret's home. Never spoke her name in public record. His silence followed him into confinement, heavy and permanent. Laura Mitchell served her time under a different kind of weight, the knowledge that fear had not erased responsibility. In court documents and media summaries, her role was defined by what she did after. The waiting. The driving. The knowing. She had not caused the violence. But she had helped it disappear. Margaret's sister returned to her own life carrying a loss that no verdict could balance. Birthdays passed. Holidays arrived with one fewer voice on the phone. Justice, she learned, did not heal, it only confirmed what could never be undone. Police later described the case as one built not on a single mistake, but on a series of decisions. Doors left open. Trust misplaced. Silence chosen when action still mattered. And that was the lesson that lingered most painfully. Because Margaret did nothing wrong. She lived quietly. She locked her doors. She followed her routines. And still, someone stepped into her life and erased it, not by accident, but by intention. In the end, the case stood as a reminder that danger does not always look dangerous, that harm can arrive softly, and that sometimes the loudest truth comes not from words, but from everything left unsaid. Margaret Hayes was not just a case number. She was a life. And her story remains, a warning whispered through an ordinary street, long after the night sounds finally faded away.